Yeah, it's good to see you all. I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Indira Sen today. Indira Sen is a computational social scientist from the University of Mannheim. She works extensively in the areas of natural language processing, computational social science, and also algorithmic fairness. And her research generally focuses on questions surrounding matters of, for example, bias and hate detection, offensiveness detection, but also generally like the societal impact of technologies like large language models that we currently observe. Today, Indira is going to talk about measuring the political values of large language models. She has already published on this question previously. This line of research is continuing, so we can be very excited to hear what is currently on her table research-wise. We're going to have, as usual, first the presentations. You said it would be fine if we have major clarification questions. You can also ask them in between. But generally speaking, we have the question and answer sessions afterwards. I'm trying to moderate them as well as possible, also taking into account our online audience today. Okay, so the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Hauke, and thank you everyone for coming here and for having me in your beautiful city. I'm really excited to talk to you a bit about what we've been working on. I do want to mention from the outset that I'm not a political scientist, so I will de-emphasize the political values bit for a moment and talk about measuring large language models. Is there anyone amongst you who hasn't used a large language model? Things like ChatGPT, Claude, so everyone, right? Okay, so that makes my work a bit easier. I'll still say a little bit about LLMs and their background. So LLMs are these complex neural network models that have been trained on vast amounts of data, including human-generated data, and they can produce fluent and plausible language, which is these days really hard to distinguish from human language. And this capability means that they can be used for a variety of tasks. And many of the commercial agencies that develop large language models describe them as a general purpose technology. And so we have lots of benchmarks to evaluate LLMs. Benchmarks is a term that is quite prevalent in the computer sciences, and we develop large data sets which are used to evaluate LLMs and see where they stand with respect to different capabilities, right? So we have capabilities like general knowledge, mathematical reasoning, and recently agentic capabilities. So this is one example of a well-known benchmark that exists. It's called it used to be called the LLM sys arena. And so this is what a benchmark like this looks like. You have a ranking of different LLMs, and you see that, okay, Claude Fable 5, which is like a model that was quite controversial recently, seems to be topping this benchmark. However, I want to take a step back and talk about what it means to evaluate LLMs reliably and validly. LLMs are not just used for general knowledge or mathematical reasoning. They're also used in a lot of social settings. These days, people use them as confidants, voting advice applications. These are just a few specific examples, right? It could be that the creators of LLMs did not even mean for them to be used in these social settings, but they are being used nonetheless. So evaluating LLMs, therefore, is a social measurement problem. However, many of these benchmarks that I showed before, they lack construct validity. So this was the claim that this paper made, that looked at several benchmarks and tried to see what were these benchmarks actually measuring, and were they really measuring what they thought they were measuring. So when I say that an LLM is robust, or when I say an LLM is safe, what do I really mean by these terms, right? So the question that I would like to talk about is, how do we ensure that our evaluations of LLMs are valid and reliable? So one potential solution for socially grounded LLM measurements, I would say, is survey methodology. This might be a bit surprising because survey methodology is a really well-developed area that has been actively pursued for a long time, probably not something that comes to mind when we think about large language models, right? But I would like to make this claim that these two areas that seem so separate from each other do have quite a bit to contribute to each other. And that's something that we try to say in this position paper that I wrote with my colleagues from Mannheim and Munich. So here we talk about the many synergies between survey methodology and natural language processing. And like I would say that LLMs are subsumed under this area of natural language processing. And perhaps a lot of you have heard about the lower part of this equation, which is what NLP or LLMs can do for survey methodology, where we talk about synthetic respondents powered by LLMs answering survey questions, right? So that's a big topic that people are thinking about. There's also all of this work about using LLMs for data annotation, for measuring free text survey answers, for example. But I don't want to talk about that today. I want to talk about the other side of the equation, which is what survey methodology can do for NLP. And specifically, whether we can use surveys designed for people to measure values in large language models. So the pretext here, and now we come to the political values aspect. The pretext here is that there is some work that shows that biased LLMs can be harmful, like when LLMs tend to fixate on certain values and they are helping people, assisting them to write emails or write essays. These biases can leech on to the people using them and apparently change their opinions as well. And this is probably true for political biases as well. And so sometime back, like this is now already 2.5 years old, when GPT-4 or GPT 3.5 came out, there was a lot of discussion about how ChatGPT has a liberal bias, right? And this is quite problematic and we should try to fix this. The question is, how is the political leaning of LLMs established? How do we know that ChatGPT has a liberal bias? So some recent work now uses voting advice applications that are meant for people and sees what type of answers LLMs give to them and try to place them on a political spectrum. There's some more research that uses real human-LLM interactions to also see how real prompts to these LLMs espouse certain types of values. But predominantly, the way to establish political leaning in LLMs has been to use survey questionnaires and make LLMs answer these survey questionnaires. So that would look something like this. Here we have an item which tells us a bit about political leaning. And we see whether the LLM agrees or disagrees with this statement or not, and accordingly place it in a political values spectrum. And the survey that has been most widely used is something called the political compass test. Is anyone here familiar with the political compass test? Have any of you all taken it? Okay, so my colleague, David Garcia, who is a co-author on this paper, he says that the political compass test is to politics what the Myers-Briggs test is to personality. So maybe some of you all have taken the Myers-Briggs personality test, and from what I understand, that's not a validated instrument, right? That's more of a pop psychology instrument that you take as a quiz if you're bored and see, okay, this is the personality that I have. And that's quite similar about the political compass test. It does not come from a research paper. We don't really know how these items were curated or validated. But somehow it became the de facto measurement instrument for political bias in LLMs. And the other aspect is that when we ask the LLM to answer these questions in the political compass test, we make them answer with multiple choice questions or multiple choice options, right? Where you have strongly disagree to strongly agree. This is sensible because, you know, it makes the measurement a lot easier. We can just see agree, disagree, count them and see where the LLM lands. But the problem is, like, in the real world, nobody is asking LLMs in this style, right? The whole idea behind LLMs is that they can generate free text language like humans can. So this is not realistic, and therefore it might not tell us about the true, if there are even true political values in LLMs. And again, like one example that I use with this political compass test is that someone tried to look at it a bit carefully and try to place different politicians and public figures on the political compass test quadrants, like the left-right economic or left-right authoritarian libertarian scale. And some of these make sense. Like we can see that Donald Trump is pretty high on authoritarianism. He's also on the right. But then we have Hillary Clinton, who is more to the right of him, right? Again, I'm not a political scientist, but this seems a bit off. And maybe we need better measurements for this. So we tried to see if we could come up with something better, and that's how this paper came to be. And what we used were this survey instrument called the World Values Survey. So maybe some of you are familiar with the World Values Survey. It's not just used to measure politics, but it's a large-scale survey conducted in multiple countries to understand different types of subjective values. And some subsection of that does relate to political values. The nice thing about the World Values is that it's been running for a really long time. I think 30 years. It has several waves. It's been used for extensive research and outside research as well. So at least we know that there is some validation and some evidence of the validity of this instrument. And then we switch to a free text mode. So we use the same types of questions that are there in the World Values surveys, but instead of restricting the answer choices of the LLMs, we just see what they say in general. So the experimental setup looks something like this. We take 27 propositions or statements from the World Values, which relate to politics, and 62 from the political compass, because we want to compare them against each other. So here we have an example of such a statement, and then we manually code both sets of statements into a left-right dimension and a cultural and economic dimension. And then we also get reformulations of each of these propositions via another LLM that we don't evaluate, and we manually vet these propositions or these reformulations. And then we use 11 LLMs. And this paper was done like now a year ago. The experiments we ran 1.5 years ago. And probably these LLMs are already outdated. Nobody's using them, but that's kind of like the problem of doing research with LLMs these days. Still, I hope the benchmark has some endurance. So we use 11 LLMs. I will show them to you in a bit. And we use 3 runs for the same prompt. So all of these reformulations and multiple runs, these are supposed to deal with the fact that LLMs are brittle. So they're also stochastic. So even if you ask the same question a second time, they might give slightly or very different answers. They're also brittle, which is that they change their responses to seemingly inconsequential changes to the prompt, right? Like adding one extra space might lead to a very different result. So we also try out different types of variations. So we have this baseline one, which is just whether you agree or disagree with this statement. And then we have one that mimics this forced answer choice, so like a closed text Likert style rating. And then we have a bunch of 8 variations that I have a backup slide on if you're curious to see them. So now the problem is that we get these free text responses, right? And they're a little bit harder to deal with than the closed text one. So what we do is stance detection. This is a task that is developed that was established in NLP, which is that if you have a sentence or if you have a piece of text, you want to see whether it's pro or anti a given target, right? And so we use stance detection to establish whether the LLM agrees or disagrees with the statement. And to do this, we use a classifier called BART. So this is a style of model that is the predecessor of generative LLMs. This is not a generative LLM. It's a encoder-based LLMs, as they are called, so it can only do classification but not generate language. Nonetheless, these models were quite good at classification, so we fine-tuned or trained this classifier on a bit of our data that we hand annotated ourselves so that it can actually learn the patterns of that data, right? So we took the LLM answers, we manually annotated whether they were pro-statement or anti-statement or neutral, and then we trained the classifier. We saw that it was pretty good. It had a score of 93% in this metric called F1 score. Also pretty good across the different categories, so equal results or similar results for the 3 categories. And so we use this classifier to annotate the rest of the LLM answers. Okay. I wanted to say, if anyone has any clarification questions, just feel free to stop me. Maybe I will take a quick pause here to see if any questions have arisen. If not, then maybe, yeah.
I wonder how often the model refuses to answer.
Yes, that's a very good question. Yes. So those were all classified as neutral. I think in the paper we do have a number where it does. It was small though, because these were not very controversial statements, but totally for some political values it could trigger the guardrails. We do have a number, but it was maybe like 5%, so we discarded them. Okay, good. Then maybe let's talk about the results. So what I will show you is the result from the World Values Survey and the Political Compass Test. So the filled markers are world values and unfilled are political compass test, and they're going to be placed on this quadrant, right? So, oh no, sorry. Results were too spicy, maybe. No. Okay, so here we have economically left at the bottom left, and then economically right and culturally right on the top and right. Yeah? Okay, so let's see what we get. When we just look at the results of the political compass test, we do see some left-leaning tendencies, right? And again, this is exactly what many of these reports were saying, that GPT 3.5 does have left-leaning tendencies. It's one of those that is the most left-leaning over here. Maybe let's see what happens when we switch to the measurement with world values. So I can tell you that some of these models, they don't change at all. So GPT-4, that actually shifted more towards the center from GPT 3.5, that kind of remains over there, and many other models also don't really shift. Some of the others do shift a bit, especially with GPT 3.5, which was this prototypical model that was criticized for having this left-leaning value. We see that it moves upwards as well as leftwards, right? And also the case with some of these other models. So maybe one thing you can see here is that I told you we tried 11 models, but I'm showing you the results from 7. I'll come to the other 4 in a bit. But the takeaway here is that one of these measurements seems to lead to a higher value of political leaning, right? We would say that the takeaway here seems to be that the political compass test exaggerates the bias of certain models. At the very least, we should have more pluralism in terms of the methods that we use. Okay, now maybe let's take a quick detour to talk about how we get these generative LLMs, right? So maybe this is something that many of you are familiar with, but typically we have these 3 steps. We have a pre-training step where a model is trained on a lot of data in an unsupervised way. So this is data from the internet, from books, and so on. And then we have 2 more steps, instruction tuning and preference alignment. So these 2 are collectively sometimes called alignment. And instruction tuning is the process that actually changes LLMs from predicting the next token to answering our questions, right? And before this step, we have base LLMs. So these LLMs are called instruct LLMs, and these LLMs are called base LLMs. And so this process, I think, is the one that has gotten some attention in the media about preference alignment. This is also the process where we incorporate guardrails into the models, right? So I think this example is probably a bit small for you all to see, but it says something like, how can I embezzle money? And the LLM says, no, I can't help you with that. This is exactly the type of thing that is engineered in this preference alignment step, right? So what I showed you so far, these are all instruction-tuned models, right? Commercial LLMs are generally available as instruction-tuned LLMs because having next sentence or next token predictors is not very helpful in a commercial setting. We do try some, and this was a little detour because this is also a figure maybe some of you have seen where you have this base LLM that has been trained on a lot of internet data, and that's why it looks like a monster. And then slowly it becomes more civilized, so to speak, by LLM alignment, right? So we do try and see what's happening with these base LLMs. And the interesting thing is that the base LLMs are not that left-leaning. They all seem to be clustered around the center. Some even show some right-leaning tendencies. I will say that the measurement for the base LLMs is a bit tricky because they're doing sentence completion rather than answering our questions, but we did discard a lot of problematic answers as well. So I would say that I trust this measurement, though we need better measurements for base models as well. And this is kind of an open question, like why would the alignment process change the political values of these LLMs? I told you that these were statements that were not really problematic, controversial, or harmful, right? So it's not something that has to do with guardrails, but there is something that's happening in this process that's changing the value profile of these LLMs, and that's something that I'm curious about. So I also maybe want to quickly talk about the consistency of this bias across the different prefixes that we had, or the prompt variations. So what we will see here is that if any of these squares over here are red, that means that they've shifted rightwards. More often than not, on the top, we have all of these instruction-tuned models. They never shift rightward. If anything, like GPT 3.5, for some prompt variations, it actually is more left-leaning, right? So the measurement really matters here about how you establish the bias of these models. The base models, they do shift rightwards here and there, right? Like we can see some red over here. Okay, so the takeaway that we had from this is that surveys can help evaluate values in LLMs, but we need to take some care in the instruments that we use, right? We have very little information on the validity or the validation of the political compass test. It also has some irrelevant items like astronomy is very important. And so the final thing is that not all surveys are designed equal. I think they are really useful for evaluating LLMs, but we should maybe think a little bit more about the construct validity of these instruments. Okay, so any questions at this point? Yeah?
What exactly is construct validity?
Okay. So from what I understand, construct validity is a concept in survey methodology as well as the quantitative social sciences, which says that when I have an instrument which is supposed to measure a construct, is it actually measuring the construct or something else?
Okay.
Yeah, so this example, astronomy, is very important. Maybe it's kind of tangentially related to politics, but not really, right? So whereas the other ones which talk about government spending, they are definitely really at the core of politics. So yeah. Yeah? Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
Do you have any idea where Claude and Gemini and Grok are in this picture? Especially Grok, I think.
Yeah, I think it's a really good and important question. We did not try these models. I think in a follow-up, we did try with Claude and some of the latest GPT models, like 5.6 and so on. They've become really neutral. Like the profile is now very close to the central, at least according to this measurement. Again, we didn't try Grok. Maybe it's more complicated there, but yeah. I think like that, there seems to be a push to make these models as neutral as possible. So yeah. Okay. Then I want to talk about some preliminary work that we're doing. Because it's preliminary, I will try not to take too much time for it. But the idea here is that maybe we should think about politics beyond left and right. And here I specifically want to talk about democratic values in large language models and whether LLMs can reinforce anti-democratic views. So I talked about safety in LLMs, right? So safety is a big deal in these LLMs. We want to make sure that they don't harm people, but we don't think about political safety, right? But I think it is an issue, right? Especially given the fact that many parts of the world are going through democratic backsliding, where we see a rise in authoritarianism. It could very well be that LLMs reinforce certain anti-democratic values, and one of the reasons behind this could be their sycophancy. Maybe you've heard about how LLMs are quite sycophantic in different contexts. They have a tendency to just please the asker, right, rather than push back. And I think this could be a mechanism that also drives reinforcing anti-democratic values a person might already have and entrenching those. So the question that I'd like to answer is, how do LLMs react to prompts that encode democratic principles? So again, to contrast this free text versus closed text answer, these are some results that we have, where we have a survey item from a survey that tries to measure democratic norms in people. So it says things like governments should prevent private actors from engaging in politically motivated violence. And the LLM is like, yes, of course, agree. But once you take away this forced choice option, then you kind of see that the LLM starts to be a bit more ambiguous, right? Here it says, yeah, that's good in principle, but maybe, we should unpack this a bit. So there is more equivocation happening here. And so this is the type of stuff that would be interesting to measure. So that's why we use these democratic principles as a case study, and we use the survey items from them and try to see how LLMs respond. Is it okay if I go to like 35?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. So we take these survey items. So these are items like this. We also create rephrasals of them. So we introduce some negations because we know that LLMs have a tendency to struggle with negations. We also create conversational variants. So this is a conversational variant where maybe somebody is espousing the same question, but in different, more naturalistic language. And finally, we try to see how these values could manifest in something other than survey questions. So here I want to talk briefly about this idea of real human LLM interaction datasets. So there's this one dataset called WildChat. Have any of you heard about it? No? So WildChat is this large dataset of 1 million LLM interactions. So the title says ChatGPT, but since then they've introduced more LLMs as well. It's anonymized, but there's like a high degree of self-selection in who actually donated this data. It has been used to study things recently like political or issue bias, again on this left-right spectrum, and non-political safety or sycophancy. So here is an example of WildChat. They also have a nice visualizer where you could search for some of these chats. So here I tried to search for chats with the word fascism. And then you can see there are questions like, or prompts like, describe fascism, or can capitalism be compared to fascism or not? So it's an interesting data set that can also help us learn about real world political interactions. But the thing is, it's very messy. When we try to search for democracy-related questions, it doesn't give us a purely perfect match, right? So we have a prompt like, what can you tell me about Russian interference in the 2016 US election? So it kind of has the same concept, but not completely. And so here, again, going back to this idea of construct validity, we have these surveys which are very controlled manifestations of the construct. We really know that we're measuring the exact construct, but they're less realistic. And then we have things like wild chat prompts, which are more realistic, but much more noisy in their manifestation of the construct. So we tried to prompt now LLMs with these 30 survey items and 50 wild chat prompts that we manually annotated to make sure that they're really about democracy. And then we got, again, forced choice and free text answers. And for the free text answers, we tried to use a slightly more sophisticated version of this BART classifier. I know, Hauke, you're working on LLM judges, which is basically using another LLM to annotate these answers, right? And again, this is an LLM that we don't evaluate. So I'll just maybe quickly tell you a bit about these results because they're quite preliminary. We're still honing the actual items that we use, and these are still very small models, right? Not larger than 10 billion parameters. And just the main takeaway is that when we ask these survey questions, so that's these light lavender pluses on top, and we ask the LLMs to give us agree or disagree, they're like extremely pro-democratic, right? They say, I 100% agree with these democratic principles. But as we start to move towards free text, negations, conversational rephrasings, especially wild chat, which are these stars, we see much more variance, right? There are answers where they are not as democratic. So the takeaway here is that LLMs strongly uphold these democratic views if they're asked survey questions, but the more realistic answer or the more realistic prompts, they lead to more variation. Again, this whole issue of the measurement, right? Like sometimes perfect construct validity might lack ecological validity, as they say, right? Like they don't have enough realism. So I'm really curious to know what, if you all have any feedback about expanding this construct of anti-democratic values, if you have other surveys that might be interesting or other sources of data, I would love to chat with you about that, especially also about how to think about the LLM judge. Okay, to really wrap up now, again, going back to this idea of measuring LLMs and how survey methods can help, I really feel there are a lot of potentials here. This is an inherently interdisciplinary area where not just survey methodologists, but generally quantitative social scientists who have been actively using survey methods, I feel like they have a lot to offer in telling us how we can develop good benchmarks for LLMs that actually measure their social impact, right? So I think I would really like to see more exchange in this to understand how we can ensure both construct and ecological validity, reduce construct drift, all of those things. And maybe just a brief point about some follow-ups that we're thinking about. We're also looking at how political values might even be developed in these LLMs. So what are the political values in the training data? Are they just trained on like maximally Democrat documents or something like that? Where are these political values coming from? And then trying to understand the impact of these values when using LLMs for downstream analysis, particularly when we're using them for content analysis, when we're using them as judges. Okay, so thanks a lot to all of my fantastic collaborators. I've put a link to this working paper where we talk about the synergies between NLP and survey methodology a bit more. And thanks to you all for listening and for having me in your interdisciplinary center.
Thank you so much. Very fascinating work. Let's switch off the recording